Call the honourable member for Port Adelaide.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Indeed, this is a matter of public importance because as we meet today in the House of Representatives, the nations of the world are meeting at the 24th Conference of the Parties, the COP, for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this morning, perhaps the most famous naturalist in the world, David Attenborough, was quoted very widely as addressing that conference and saying this about climate change. Mr Attenborough described climate change as, I quote, a man-made disaster on a global scale and our greatest threat in thousands of years of human existence. This very grave statement by the most legendary naturalist on the face of the planet, I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, follows the recent publication of a confronting report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which laid out the impacts of climate change at a level of 2 degrees Celsius of global warming on the one hand and 1.5 degrees Celsius following the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. And that report shows that 2 degrees, even 2 degrees of global warming will have a devastating impact on our natural environment and human society as we understand it. Just as one example, Mr Deputy Speaker, the IPCC has said that at 2 degrees of global warming, more than 99% of the world's coral reefs will be destroyed. Almost all of our world's coral reefs will be destroyed. Our own coral reef, of course, the Great Barrier Reef, one of the seven natural wonders of the world, has already been subject to 2 major bleaching events in the last 3 years, and the Bureau of Meteorology only recently advised that there is a 70% chance of an El Niño building in the Pacific over the course of the coming summer, which would place the reef under threat of the 3rd major bleaching event in just 4 years. Before that, in recorded history, Mr Deputy Speaker, before these last 3 years, there has only been 1 major bleaching event in the recorded history of the Great Barrier Reef. It's not just those impacts, and it's not just the IPCC report that has underlined the gravity of even 2 degrees of global warming. The World Bank only a couple of years ago indicated that 2 degrees of global warming would wipe out as much as 20% of global cereal production, including 50%, fully 50% of cereal production on the continent of Africa, which, as we know, is already struggling to feed its people and will be the area where most of the world's population increase over coming decades occurs. And the really grave thing about these reports, Mr Deputy Speaker, is we are not even close to tracking to keeping global warming below 2 degrees, not even close. At the moment, we're advised that we're currently tracking to somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees of global warming, which would have impacts that are barely able to be imagined. The world now, Mr Deputy Speaker, is facing a climate emergency. This will be an emergency that doesn't unfold over the course of the coming year or even few years. This will be an emergency that unfolds over coming decades. But we are starting to see the impacts of climate change now. Much earlier than 20 or 25 years ago, we were advised we'd see those impacts. We are starting to see them now, and they are frightening. Barack Obama said when he was still President of the United States, Deputy Speaker, that ours is the first generation to see the impacts of climate change, to feel them, and the last generation with the ability to do something about stopping them. And last week, here in Australia, literally thousands of students, overwhelmingly with the permission of their parents, decided to take a day off school and to march in the streets to protest at this parliament and this government's lack of reasonable action. Now, we all want students to go to school. We all want kids to go to school. But I think on this side of the parliament we also understand the deep frustration that young Australians at school and beyond school age feel at the lack of action by our generation on climate change, particularly in this building. I talk to young Australians, as I know members of this House across the aisle talk to young Australians all the time, and I understand, I hear them saying just how let down they feel by our generation in dealing with something that they feel is going to be such a substantial issue over the course of what we hope will be their very, very long lives. They feel let down in an unforgivable way. And none of us should fall for the rubbish that is often spouted by commentators, and unfortunately some on the other side of this House, Mr Deputy Speaker, that Australia doesn't matter in this debate. What Australia does doesn't matter. I mean, yes, we are a small nation, Deputy Speaker. We don't even rate in the top 50 of the world's nations in population, but we rate in the top 15 in the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted from this economy. Not in the top 50 on population, but in the top 15 in total greenhouse gases. We are a wealthy nation that has grown wealthy on the back of long-term industrialisation, along with other members of the OECD. We are the highest per capita, the highest per head of population producer of greenhouse gases. If Australia won't act, Mr Deputy Speaker, if Australia won't take responsible, strong action on climate change, which nation on the face of the planet should be expected to act? We have a deep responsibility in this area as a good global citizen, as a friend and a neighbour of communities in our region for whom climate change poses an existential threat. And as parents, as grandparents, as uncles and aunties, we have a generational responsibility to do everything we reasonably can to ensure that our children and our grandchildren enjoy a natural environment that is at least as good as the one that we enjoy. We are a wealthy nation, but it is in our interests, our own self-interest, to act on climate change because we are also a deeply vulnerable continent to the impacts of climate change. This is a continent that already pushes us up right against the limit of human tolerance in heat. This is a continent that has agricultural regions that are deeply vulnerable to very clear structural trends already identified by the Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO in rainfall, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin region in eastern Australia and in the wheat belt in the southwest of Western Australia. We largely live on coasts, with coastal communities that are deeply vulnerable to very quickly accelerating sea level rise, which over time will pose risks to literally billions and billions of dollars of assets. And we know that already the increase in heat events and other extreme weather events are posing a substantial risk to the health of Australians. And in this area, government action and government policy matters. When we were in government, carbon pollution levels came down by more than 10% in those 6 years. We were the fourth most attractive investment destination in renewable energy. We had state governments in New South Wales and Queensland finally acting on an end to broad-scale land clearing of remnant vegetation. And this government's record could not be different. Carbon pollution has been rising since this government came to office and is projected to continue to rise all the way to 2030, which is far as the government's projections go. The new Minister for Climate Change can't even pinpoint a date at which she thinks carbon pollution might eventually peak. We are now pretty much the only major advanced economy where carbon pollution and greenhouse gases are going up rather than coming down. And in spite of the Prime Minister and all of his ministers getting up at this dispatch box and doing media conferences to say that we're going to meet our targets in a canter, no one believes them. Their own data don't show it. The United Nations emissions gap report from a couple of weeks ago don't show it because it's simply not happening. As Malcolm Turnbull said again today, as Rob Stokes said on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, this federal coalition is simply genetically incapable of taking climate change action. It is so deeply divided. It is incapable of taking action in this policy area. And it doesn't have to be that way. The UK Conservatives understood that this was in the national interest. They're tracking to a budget at around 2030 of not a 5% reduction in carbon pollution, which is this government's track record, but a 61% reduction in carbon pollution. At the same time, they're producing about 3 times as much steel as Australia and have 800,000 workers still working in the automotive industry, an industry which this government shut down in Australia, demonstrating that decarbonisation and the maintenance of a strong industrial base is possible and is consistent with a strong, growing economy. As Malcolm Turnbull has said, this coalition is just incapable. Its division, its ideological obsessions are holding this nation hostage on a critically important policy area. The division in this coalition party room is holding future generations hostage. That's why they were marching in the streets last week. Labor isn't just ready, Mr Deputy Speaker. We're not just ready to take action here. We are impatient to take action because we know This is in the national interest. This is in our children's interest. This is in our grandchildren's interest. But to look after that interest, we need a change of government.